Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest introduced to you now. Dr. Adam Nally, popularly known as Doc Muscles, is the go-to, no-nonsense, community-based physician, author, speaker, and live streamer, providing practical weight management and general medical health through a distinctly individualized ketogenic, low-carbohydrate, and/or paleolithic lifestyle, combined with a cutting-edge medical approach. With over 18 years of practical, in the trenches medical experience and an enchantingly passionate, articulate, and genuine approach to the treatment of the diseases of civilization, he is an extremely valuable asset to his patients and his community. As a family physician, father of two, former Air Force physician, horseman, Eagle Scout, and aquaponics gardener, Dr. Nally is a highly sought after international keynote speaker and presenter to a wide scope of audiences, including physicians, universities, churches, educators, and patients of any age. He can help you with your medical issues from diaper to diaper. That is hilarious. I love that. He is the author of The Keto Cure, a low carb, high fat dietary solution to heal your body and optimize your health, which details the way that the ketogenic diet can help remedy common ailments. You can find him on his website at www.docmuscles.com. Dr. Adam Nally, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, it's such an honor. And like I said, it's so cool. Like I never get used to opening up these Zoom calls and getting to see and chat with some of the people that I've looked up to for a very long time. You've been in this space for so long and putting out as much content as you have. I've been familiar with your work for a long time. So it's such an honor to host you.
Thank you. It's always fun. It's what I love doing. So it's a pleasure to be here.
That's great. That's great. We're both from the same home state. I'm currently living in South Jordan, Utah. Wasn't born here, but basically raised here. And you're also from just the valley down south of us in Orem, Utah.
Yeah. Orem, Utah. I lived there until I was 17. My mother was from Lehigh, but my father was from Phoenix. And so my father pulled the family down here to Phoenix, and I've been here since I was 17. So I have ties in both places.
Yeah, that's nice. I've heard you can't shovel sunshine. Is that true?
You can't shovel sunshine, no. It doesn't tire you out.
That sounds amazing. I've got no complaints this winter. I don't know why this has happened, but all of the snow has stayed in the mountains. So our snowpack is actually really good. And in the valley, I've maybe shoveled a total of like 4 or 5 inches the entire winter. So
wow,
no complaints for me.
Wow, that's awesome.
No complaints at all. And then also, I have to ask you about this. I'm not sure if you're a hockey fan or not, but one of the greatest gifts I've ever gotten in my life is the hockey team in Arizona has been acquired by Utah and is now the Utah Hockey Club. I've been a huge fan. I play several times a week, and now I get to go watch NHL games in my own valley, which is absolutely amazing. The team wasn't particularly cared for. And again, I'm not sure if you're a fan, but does the common Arizona resident really care that the team is gone? It didn't seem like they had the biggest following down there.
Well, because it's hot, the people, so about half the population in Arizona love the hockey team, and because they're transplants from the Northwest or Northeast or wherever, and so hockey in that perspective was big, but it didn't catch on as much because we're such a hot location. So hockey didn't have that. I think to love hockey, you have to have some teenage or childhood background behind it. And so I enjoyed going to the games, but I just didn't have the time to keep up with it. And I never really had the background behind it to make me just love it or fall in love with it. But I enjoyed going to the games that I went to. And it was, to be honest, they're some of the most memorable games as a family that we would go see. And so my wife told me a couple times, we got to get season hockey tickets. But every time we tried to look for them, it didn't work out that year or that season.
Yeah. And they weren't always playing in the most convenient location in Phoenix. I know that. And I've also heard that since you have all the people from, Michigan and Minnesota that moved to Phoenix to escape the snow, it's almost like you go to a Cardinals game and there's more Packers fans than there are like Cards fans. I wonder if that was part of the issue.
It was, yeah. It was because the hockey team was from Arizona, very few people thought that they actually could or would do very well. And so there wasn't a lot of support from that side of it. But hockey's great, and it's been around here for years. There's an arena on the west side, there's an arena on the east side. So we'll see what happens over time.
Yeah, I certainly hope it comes back for all the diehard fans down there. But I was just curious if like the common Arizona resident really cared or not if the team was there. So I appreciate that insight. Man, you have been calling balls and strikes in this world for a very, very long time. You have a very interesting the history of finding this stuff. Can you tell us your kind of story of how the reason why you wanted to be a doctor, what happened with your health and the health of your family, and what led you to find low carbohydrate diets?
Yeah, I always wanted to be a doctor. It's always been interesting since I was a teenager. I saw a lady get hit by a car, and I went up to this accident because we were the first people on the scene. There was a number of us, and I remember walking up and seeing her, and she had fractured her leg, and it was a femur fracture, so it was pretty bad. And I realized at that moment in time, I didn't know how to help her, and I suddenly felt completely helpless and realized for me to feel normal about myself and feel like I could do what I need to do, I needed to be able to understand how to help people in medicine. So that kind of started my journey. When I got into medicine, I realized that I really enjoyed, at first I thought I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. I worked with them while I was in undergrad and enjoyed that part of it. When I actually got into medicine, I realized I really enjoyed the endocrinology and the banter that occurred as a family physician. So I directed my training towards family physician that way. One of the guys that I trained with were osteopaths, so they did spinal manipulation as well. And I watched them do that when I was training and really found a great interest in that as well. So I went off to, instead of being an MD, which they have here in Arizona, as they did when I was in school, then they still have it. But I went off to a DO school, and Kirksville in Missouri was the school that I went to. And I gained the understanding of general medicine plus manipulation with a focus on family medicine. The challenge is my dad had severe diabetes, and he was diagnosed with diabetes probably in his early 40s. And he had progressed to where he was insulin dependent, and he ended up dying at 58. And he weighed about 400 pounds, almost 400 pounds when he passed
Oh my
away.
goodness.
His first heart attack was in his 40s, and that bothered me. And he had a couple of great doctors that were very good, but just no matter what he did, he kept gaining weight, kept having heart disease, kept having problems with blood pressure and blood sugar, and so it never really improved. And that was, and I watched it in my grandparents, I watched it in extended family members. And when I got in medical school, I realized his labs and my labs looked identical at age 32, and that bothered me a lot. But what the medical school taught didn't give us any answers. So I strongly remember my first day in medical school where the vice president of the school stood up and said, "I'm supposed to speak to you for 30 minutes." He says, "I just have one thing to say." And this was a 30-year-old surgeon, or he'd been in practice for 30 years as a general surgeon. He probably was in his late 60s. And he said, 50% of what we teach you here in medical school is wrong. We just don't know which 50%. And then he sat down, and I went, whoa. So first day of medical school, that was his instruction to us. And I went, okay, that must mean something. And I logged it in the back of my head. Well, I went through school and got into residency. And in residency, I started seeing these patterns of things with triglycerides and blood sugar, and realizing that a lot of things we were taught weren't correct. And so I started pointing out to myself, we were taught this, but this changed. We were taught this, but this changed. As I went from medical school to residency to general practice, the numbers for diabetes changed, and the diagnosis of diabetes changed and got tighter, and a lot of things changed. And so I started realizing 50% of what we thought we know, we don't really know. And so the important thing to realize as a physician is I've got to be able to realize is what I'm taught true, and if it's not true, what is the truth? So I started out early on in my career with that focus, and so just kept my mind open as I was going through those things. And so I saw triglycerides and cholesterol. I saw blood sugar. I started seeing insulin, and I started realizing that insulin played a bigger role than blood sugar did when we started using it, but no one taught that in school or residency, and a lot of people teach that now. Very few do. And so I started watching these patterns, and when I started seeing these patterns, and when we changed certain things about insulin or cholesterol or things of that nature, a whole slew of diseases changed. And so when I started addressing insulin as the culprit behind diabetes rather than just the blood sugar, 16 different diseases in my practice began to dramatically improve or go away. And that's what blew me away. So that's where I wrote the first book, The Keto Cure, because it actually, I saw these patterns over and over and over for I think it was probably 15 years. And at that time, during that whole period of time, in the back of my mind, not wanting to gain weight and have heart disease and things like that, I had tried vegetarianism and veganism and a Mediterranean diet, and I'd gone through all these dietary approaches, and I was exercising 1 to 2 hours a day and running triathlons with my wife, and I was still gaining weight, and it wasn't working. And I ended up having sleep apnea and all these things that occurred because I was gaining weight, and it was a problem. It was like all these things that I was taught to do aren't effective in myself or the patients. So a big part of it was really selfish on my part because I wanted to be able to feel better and be healthy and be around long enough to play with my grandkids. My father died before he got to really play with the grandkids, so that really bothered me. And so that's the driver behind why I did it what I do. And now my focus is if I see something, I'll keep a note, and I'll watch for journal articles that'll occur, and then I'll watch for patterns that happen as I start to practice or apply different approaches to medicine. So there's a lot of good in general medicine. There's a lot of good in Eastern or Asian medicine. There's a lot of interesting. There's a lot of different things we see in different approaches. So I've become a lot more. What's the term? I'm trained in Western medicine, but I also do a lot of alternative approaches because of what I've learned over 25 years. And so I've been in practice now 25 years since residency, and so that's played a big role in my life. I don't know if that's a long-winded answer, but
No, that's fantastic. It must have been interesting to hear, day one of medical school, the guy get up there and tell you that half of the things that we're going to teach you are wrong, and we don't even know which ones they are. To have that kind of mindset of like, oh, I'm a scientist, I'm going to ask questions, I'm going to learn things, we're going to have this open-minded approach to things, to then get into the system and find that they're not actually approaching it in that way. That must have been incredibly frustrating for you. Just a huge dissonance between those two things.
Well, it was. I mean, the osteopathic approach to medicine is a little more open, but there's still some significant, blinders on people. The allopathic approach to medicine is even much more strict and stringent. And so what I would watch is these dogmas being followed just vehemently. Yet insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And that's a lot of times what many physicians end up doing in some areas. Most physicians, I truly think, want to help and want to do the right thing, but we're so roped into the road or the path that we're on that we often don't remember, hey, as a scientist, it's my job to ask questions. And what happened through COVID and the early 2020s is that we got tied into, you cannot ask any questions, you cannot be a scientist. And that was really frustrating. But the nice thing is I had 20 years of experience to show me that you can always ask a question and you can always try a different approach. And in doing so, many times you'll actually see great benefit and you'll gain a bit of learning. That's the last 5 years, they've almost attempted to wipe that out of people's minds. And that's one of the things that has been floating my boat for the last 5 years is, as a physician and a scientist, my job is to see things and then ask questions and determine, are we wrong or not wrong? And if it's working, great. If it's not working, why not?
Yeah, good point. And I think the only positive that maybe came out of that is that the pendulum has to swing. And it seems like there's a lot of people today that smell a rat that were not smelling rats 5 years ago when all that stuff was coming out. So if there is any positive, I think of that as kind of a little bit more optimistic. So I love this story. I've heard you tell this story before. How was it that you actually found out about this diet? Again, as early as you did, not many people were talking about it back then, even though, I mean, even just in science, we knew about it for 100 years at that point.
Yeah. So I had been in practice for 5 years, and a number of my patients from residency had followed me into practice. And I remember one lady told me, she said, Dr. Nally, for every year I've seen you, you give me a new drug. So I'd seen her for 5 years, and I was now giving her 5th drug. And she said, this is not what I expected. And I thought to myself, she's absolutely right. If I see somebody for 20 years, I'll put them on 20 drugs. And that doesn't feel right to me. Something's wrong with that. We're not doing something right if that's the case. But yet that's what most people do. If you see a doctor, you'll probably get a new drug every year, at least one. And that's what happened to my father. He was on 32 pills a day, and it was just astronomical. And so I started realizing, and most of these drugs were either weight drugs, they were cholesterol drugs, they were blood sugar drugs, or blood pressure drugs. So and they seemed to correlate together. And so when one would occur, another would occur, and we would often have to give a drug to counteract the side effects of another drug. So about 5 years into this, I was at a conference here in Phoenix, and I was listening to a doctor out of Idaho who came down, and he was a weight loss specialist. And he basically started explaining that, he brought his, I guess it was about 2 years of data from his practice. He'd been practicing for like 15 years, 20 years. And he showed this 2 years of 9,000 pounds of weight loss. And he was just basically walking through the things he was doing. And so afterwards, I walked to him and I said, what you've just described is basically the Atkins diet. I thought that didn't work. In medical school, we were told it didn't work. And he looked at me and he started laughing and he said, well, it's a modified Atkins diet. And I said, well, how are you getting this? Because I was told in school that didn't work. And the studies that they quoted at that point in time doesn't work. He said, Adam, you need to hear how this diet really works. And he says, if you really want to know, there's a conference in 2 weeks in California. It was actually at Disneyland. He says, go there and listen to this and you'll learn a great deal. And at the time, Gary Taubes, who had written Good Calorie, Bad Calorie, had just published his book and he was actually speaking at that conference. And I had heard a little bit about him, but I didn't know a lot about him. So I called my wife and said, hey, we're going to California and it's at Disneyland, take the kids. I may be there 3 days. And if the conference is good, I'll stay at the conference. If not, we'll go have fun 3 days at Disneyland. So it was a good trade-off. So
Win-win.
I showed up and my wife didn't see me for 3 days. I actually hit this conference and it was the best obesity conference I have ever heard. It was like drinking out of a fire hose because everything that I had questioned for 5 years and all the problems I had experienced with vegetarianism and veganism and the Mediterranean diet and all the problems I had seen and my patients had seen for 5 years literally were laid out. And I went, oh my word. So then the other piece was that they started showing that it's not the sugar, or it's not the fat, it's the sugar. And that had been brainwashed out of me for 5 years in medical school. So I started questioning myself because they were showing this data from different patients and experiences that patients were losing weight, seeing all these improvements in blood sugar and blood pressure and all this control. So I went home with my wife and said, I'm going to try this Atkins thing and it might kill me, but if it works, then I've got something to look at. And she came from a family of her mother was a home ec teacher, and so fat was essentially the demon, and you don't ever eat bacon because it was horrible, So I went home and I literally I would have between a half pound and a pound of sausage and eggs for breakfast, a piece, 2 or 3 hamburger patties for lunch, and a steak for dinner. And I lost 45 pounds. No, it was 75
Wow.
pounds. No, it was 75. I dropped 75 pounds, and I maintained that for a while, and I realized this is amazing. So I started encouraging my patients to follow this because they watched the weight loss in me. And then I started getting a bunch of kickback from cardiologists and nephrologists because I was telling people to eat fat. So I realized, okay, this is the only thing I've ever seen that worked. It's the only thing that's ever changed my blood work significantly. And if it's working, I have to understand how it works. And so I basically spent the next 3 or 4 years studying so I could become an expert in nutrition because all these other doctors were telling me I was committing malpractice because I was telling them to eat fat and cut out their carbs. And that's really where it came from. So I realized if I'm going to do this in an area here in Phoenix where I have all these older patients over 65, they're at risk for heart disease and stroke, I have to know this stuff backwards and forwards. So that's what I did. I just started studying it as hard as I could. And if it worked, I would study it and then find the science behind it and figure out where it was. And the reason I really wrote the book was there was a lot of information about diabetes and kidney function and a lot of things. What really happens when you do this from a ketogenic perspective that was in the literature, but no one had pulled it into a book. And so that's what I did.
That's amazing. Brother, you and I know how amazing it is to go to a low carbohydrate conference. Like
Yeah.
we run our own business. I can't take vacation days very often. Low carbohydrate conferences are my vacations. And I don't go to San Diego to lay on the beach as much as I would love to. I go to sit in a conference room because that's how amazing they are. And to try to imagine what it'd be like to go to the first one that I've ever heard about that early to learn all that stuff novel, like this is the first time you're learning about it. You must have been fired up out of your mind.
Well, it was interesting because half the group, and there was probably 600 people there, 300 of them were very low carb positive, and the other fat was the demon. And so there was literal physical tension in the room when these were talked about. And so what would happen is you'd have one guy lecture about low carb, and then you have another guy get up and lecture about low fat, and then low carb. And there was daggers coming, and so it was actually quite interesting to watch. But I had already lived the low fat world, and it didn't work for my patients or myself. So I had realized from experience, this isn't working. And despite what the science says, it's not working when you apply it. And I had applied it really strictly, and it still didn't work. So then when I saw the low carb world, and I said, okay, well, I'm going to try this. And then when I started seeing dramatic success, then I just jumped on the bandwagon. And I went to every extra training I could. I read every article. I did a 500-hour basically a fellowship in low carb at the time, taught by Eric Westman. And we read every weight loss article from 1880 through whatever it was, 1990 or or 2005 or whatever it was. I can't remember. So I literally read all those articles. And I went back through Gary Tubbs's book and I pulled out and read every quoted article in that 900-page book. And that's really where I got my information from. Gary Tubbs literally gave us that data to have. He did such a wonderful job over 5 or 6 years in writing that book. And so that's where all that science is, but no one would quote it because it wasn't the acceptable approach. Mainly because there's nobody funding it. You don't have some big pharma company or some big food company funding that. And so that's really where it comes from. So it was very fascinating and very exciting to experience, and somewhat exciting from the perspective of you've got two very opposed camps.
Yeah. Super interesting. I always marvel at these conferences, like an hour after lunch, you'd expect everybody be nodding off or tired, and everybody ketogenic is all super enthusiastic. So you probably could have looked around and said, oh, the low fat people are nodding off, but all the low carb people are still going. That's really interesting.
It was. Yeah. And wow. It was fascinating. We watched, then you got to see the evolution of this. For a long time ago, it was, when I started, it was just called low carb. And you wouldn't say Atkins because Atkins had a bad name, because of the products and for a number of reasons. So we avoided the word Atkins and we used low carb. Well, then we realized there's this ketosis thing that's occurring. So then they started shifting into a ketogenic diet. And then it got to carnivore. And now it's, so you're seeing this over 25 years, I've seen it's the same diet. It's just, you're seeing that the terms are changed.
That's crazy. That's so cool to be able to watch that. The way I like to find truths, not that we can ever arrive and say that this is absolutely true or not, but at least have good idea that things are true, is that over time they seem more and more and more true. There's less holes. It's better explained. We have less questions about things. Whereas if something seems false, the more time that goes by, the more holes there are, the more it doesn't make a lot of sense. The more exceptions, there's paradoxes, which just means like, well, maybe your theory isn't right. And so I'm wondering the common things that people say about a ketogenic diet, a carnivore diet. You can overconsume protein, or the cholesterol thing, or saturated fat, or any one of those things that people say, rightfully so. They should say in the beginning. They should have questioned these things, because if not, it means they haven't been paying attention to anything in the world of nutrition, or what they have been recommended to eat. But for you, for being in this world for so long, the concerns that you must have had when you first started, have any of them borne out to be a concern about somebody doing a long-term ketogenic or carnivore diet?
Never. That's the interesting thing. I've done ketosis, or some degree of it. I'm right now about 95% carnivore myself, but some form of ketogenic diet for literally 18 years solid. And it has been life-saving for me. So if you remember, I had the same labs my dad did at 32, looked like my dad at that age group. My dad's first heart attack was in his 40s, early 40s, 42. He ended up having 5 heart attacks over the years. The first one was a quintuple bypass and then multiple stents thereafter, and then died at 58 of kidney failure because of all these issues. I just had a heart cath because an ER doctor in Florida thought I was dying, and it was actually just really bad food poisoning. And the heart cath showed, the cardiologist came to me and said, "You have the cleanest arteries of a 54-year-old I've ever seen." And so I know that 18 years of this keeps the stuff clean. That's my personal experience. I've seen that with multiple patients. I've seen reversal of plaque in now 6 of my current patients, in both heart and carotids. So I know this works long term. The only reason people say it's not sustainable is because it's not easy to cook every meal. Most people are so lazy. We're so used to eating fast food that people go, well, it's not sustainable. You can't sustain that. Well, it actually is if you cook and prepare your own meals. And you actually are more healthy that way. But that takes time and it takes effort. And you have to have a why. It has to be a reason. Why are you doing this? My why is I want to be around for my grandkids. That's what I want to do. I don't want to be dead when at 58. That's not my desire. But in order to do that, I know I have to eat a certain way. I know I have to stay physically active. I have to be, and then the other thing is now I've got kids and family. How do I teach my family to do it and not fear food? Because, on the flip side, you can create anorexia and you can create food fear. And so the most important thing is teaching people carbohydrates play a role, fat plays a role, protein plays a role. You need to understand why are you using those fuels. And what a lot of people don't realize is that they're not bad. You just get certain responses from those foods. And that's what it's taken me, for the first 10 years of my practice was trying to learn. I used to say, well, carbs are bad. Carbs aren't bad. They're just a certain, they have a hormonal response, as does fat and as does protein. So if you realize that the food you put in your mouth has a hormonal signal to your body, then you can start to approach it a different way.
Yeah, well explained. I think that's one of the most important things I have to point out to somebody when they're first learning about nutrition, like a seminar setting or something. This is what protein is. This is what it does, and this is what it doesn't do. Like, don't expect protein to give you energy. You need that from fat or carbohydrates. Like, to go through some of those things, most people have no idea what any of that means, and so they don't understand those interactions. And yeah, I just got back from Dave Feldman's conference in Las Vegas and watched the movie that's coming out later this year called The Cholesterol Code.
Oh,
And they did
cool.
release the 1 year data from the people that were getting the heart scans after having extremely high cholesterol for a long time. And I don't know if I'm supposed to reveal the numbers, but there were a few people that regressed, and the numbers are very, very, very good. I mean, these are people that have sky high LDL cholesterol in particular, and their heart scans look absolutely amazing. And even in the few that did have some regression, it had nothing to do with the actual level of the cholesterol. So
Yeah.
again, just more confirmation as we're learning more and more about this, about the things we've been taught are probably not the truth.
Well, I was taught that LDL was the marker for heart disease, and and total cholesterol was another marker for heart disease and stroke. And they're both worthless measurements when you look at those LDL-C or total cholesterol in looking at risk for heart disease or risk for stroke. Those are completely worthless to measure. And you learn that from seeing that when you shift your diet, you're going to see shifts in those numbers normally because your fuel type shifts. What's the real marker for heart disease and stroke? It's a different piece of that molecule, which most doctors don't measure. And so that's the part that I've had to learn over the last few years is what are we really measuring? What's really the tool to measure to determine are you going to live longer or shorter?
What are your favorite markers on that note? I'd be very curious to see which ones you like to look at the
So
most.
all I look at when it comes to cholesterol is I look at small dense LDL particle, because that is the small particle, and that's the non-oxidized form of LDL, and that's the one that creates risk for heart disease. And then that changes every 3 or 4 days. The triglyceride is the second marker for that. That's also showing your body, just telling whether or not you oxidized your molecules that in that 24-hour period. So if your insulin's up, you get a bunch of triglycerides. If your insulin's down, you get triglycerides under 100. If your insulin's up, you will see a rise in small dense LDL particle above 500 that will last for 3 or 4 days. When your insulin's below, down in the 6 or 5 range, you will see a reversal of small dense LDL particle. So it's not just sugar, it's anything that raises the insulin for a 3-day window prior to your lab test. That's what it is. And if you measure that, then you can watch the atherosclerosis either come or go, depending on what you're doing. And those are the only 2 cholesterol molecules I measure. Now, I realize now they've got all these fancy measurements and calculations that you can do, and they're not effective. They literally are not effective in determining risk. So someone shows up in my office, I can check their cholesterol every 3 months, and I can tell you, hey, predominantly in the last 4 days, this is what your diet's like, and you need to change this and this and this. And usually what I do is we'll tease out, what carbs are you eating, and then they'll come back and go, well, my cholesterol is still high, and I cut out the carbs. Yeah, well, what sweeteners are you eating? And what other substances are you eating that raise your insulin? And that's where the money is in my book.
Yeah, interesting. I love that. And I would also assume that the poor man's version, if somebody only had triglycerides and say HDL cholesterol, that would be enough to point you in a direction and make you fairly confident that their metabolic health is pretty good.
If your triglycerides are under 100, then I know that the diet you ate within 24 hours before your blood test is pretty good. If your total cholesterol is above 200, if you look at all the studies out there, there is not a single study of 95-year-olds where their total cholesterol is not over 250. And so what we know, especially the Okinawans, they eat food that's high in fat enough that keeps their total cholesterol high. And Okinawa being one of those blue zones, which in my perspective is a fallacy. But they eat in Okinawa, they eat a bunch of Spam. That's part of their food source, and that's high in fat, because Spam is a substance that I watched them eat for years, and I ate it with them. Yeah, they have fish, but they get Spam too. And that's because they're an island culture that's not necessarily, they consider themselves a different culture than Japanese, the older patients do, but that's part of their diet. And so they're physically active, they eat a lot of Spam.
Wow. Well, Dan Buettner told me they eat purple sweet potatoes.
They do, and those are good too, but they only eat maybe one. I mean, it's not a huge amount. And so I used to eat them all the time. they have trucks that'll come by like the candy or the popsicle trucks in here in Arizona. They play music and they pull up and there's a purple
Oh,
potato
wow.
wrapped in. Kids will run out and buy a potato off the truck.
Oh man, I love bashing blue zones. It's cool that you were able to eat those there, but they make it sound like that's all they ate. That was like the
Yeah, they make it
primary
sound like it's
thing.
just primary. That's not true. That's
Yeah,
not what their diet
yeah.
is.
I've
I
heard
lived
from
there for
Dr.
2 years. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I was going to say you lived there. You had experience. Dr. Bill Schindler went to which one was it? Sardinia, and he said the people are so confused why people keep showing up. I've been doing documentaries about them eating minestrone soup. It's like we sometimes eat minestrone soup, but why do you want to keep learning about this? We're eating goat. Like
Exactly.
it's so
Yeah, yeah.
strange.
I don't know about the other countries, but I know about Okinawa, and
Yep.
it is not a low fat country.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair said. I really appreciate that.
They eat a lot of rice, but also they eat a bunch of seaweed. And if you remember, brown seaweed has a carbohydrate inhibitor. It actually
Oh,
suppresses between 20 and 40% of carbohydrate absorption in the gut. So
interesting.
seaweed is a natural carb suppressor. And so
Wow.
when you're eating a bunch of rice, but you're also eating seaweed, you'll notice that you won't gain weight. That's the difference between Asian cultures and US. When Japanese come to Arizona or United States and they eat a bunch of rice, but there's no seaweed, they all gain weight.
Fascinating. Wow. I never considered that. That's really interesting. I have to ask you as well. You're an expert in women's health. How you hear that it can be complicated, especially for women who are cycling if they're doing strict ketogenic carnivore diets. What is your opinion on women's health doing the same kind of diet? I definitely believe most men can really thrive. I think it gets a little bit more complicated with women and more considerations, obviously, again, when somebody is cycling. But what have you observed as far as women handling a ketogenic or even a zero carbohydrate type diet?
So the difference between women and men is women go through 3 stages in life, men only have one essentially. And so the challenge is that a lot of times women don't realize what's happening to themselves in that regard. And because of the large amount of xenoestrogens and soy products that we have in our diet currently, there's going to be a significant amount of change that has heavily influenced the estrogen levels and testosterone levels of females. One of the biggest challenges I found after doing this for about probably the first 10 or 12 years was that I would get people on a ketogenic diet and the women would have great success. And then suddenly they would plateau, or there'd be a group of them, about 10 to 15% they would not be able to lose weight. Nothing, no matter what we did with their diet. And then they go, this keto thing doesn't work. Well, what I realized is I realized that number one, 85% of people need to do the diet. The ketogenic diet is the only diet I'm comfortable with, or carnivore, or some degree of low carb. Second is that if their thyroid is off, you won't see weight loss and improvements. And then the third step, which is the other 10, 15%, is you've got to balance hormones. So about 10 to 15% of women won't have thyroid corrected, and the other 10 to 15% of women will be estrogen dominant or have some problem with their female hormones. So the last part of my career, the last probably 15 years, I've spent a great deal of time trying to understand how do we balance hormones, thyroid and women's hormones, when we get the diet correct. And so what I learned is that if you try to fix the hormones and the thyroid, female hormones and thyroid first, and the diet's not right, it'll never work. So if you fix the diet first, then the second thing is your thyroid, third thing is your female hormones. And if you do it in that order, the weight falls right off. And it's been great. But what women don't realize is that there's a premenopausal, there's a pre-fertility range, young girls, and then as soon as they hit menstruation for between anywhere from 13 to 50 or 55, then there is the birthing years, or the times when they're able to conceive, and then at somewhere between 49 and 55 they shift into menopause, and there are benefits to each of those phases, and you have to understand, number one, why would a woman do this? What's the benefit to doing that? Which is part of the reason I wrote the book, is because a lot of physicians think, well, we want women to be like men, just have one cycle. You don't want that. That women have a need to have these 3 periods of cycle in their life because they're what they do as women and as mothers and as nurturers. Their hormones play a big role in that. So I have found that if the diet is correct, it's going to be the most effective way to balance the hormones. Now, a large percent, well, probably between 25 or 35% of women, for whatever reason it may be, their diet, their lifestyle, their other foods they're using, exposures to different xenoestrogens, they may very well need some additional hormone manipulation to fix that. The diet fixes about 85% of it, but it doesn't fix the other 15%. So 15% of those hormones may need to have addition or either supplements or bioidentical hormones added to help them balance that out. That
Okay.
was a long-winded answer. But
No, no, that's great. This gets really complicated for me, and you just did an amazing presentation explaining some of this stuff and the interactions. And I thought one thing was really interesting is that there's women are aging through the different progressions. The link between all of these hormones and dementia, I thought was fascinating. If you could kind of explain that a little bit deeper, that's not something I don't think we've ever covered on the show.
so yeah, we've poo-pooed hormone replacement for a period of time. The Women's Health Initiative came out and a bunch of people decried hormone replacement, and they said you shouldn't have hormones, it's bad, it causes breast cancer, does all these things. Then they later came out and very quietly said, oh, we were wrong, but nobody said anything about it. And so there's this mindset in many people, including physicians, that think that, oh, female hormone replacement is bad. But if you don't get the estrogen balanced, and if you don't get the progesterone to estrogen ratio correct, your risk for dementia as a female it goes up to 50%. So your risk for early aging, rapid dementia, Alzheimer's dementia is 50%. The brain will shrink and change, and so it's essential to understand that during the child rearing years, women need a certain level of hormone. After that, they still need hormone. They don't need as much, but they need those hormones. And the ratio of estrogen to progesterone has to be balanced. If it's not, they're going to see all the menopausal symptoms, which we thought were normal, are not normal. If you're having symptoms of menopause, your hormones are off. They're broken, and we got to fix them. And so if you're having hot flashes, that's a sign to me that your risk for dementia is at 50% already. And so we want to help change that, because what the sign of hot flashes and weight gain around the middle and hair loss means is your hormones are screwed up. And then not only is it happening on the outside, it's happening in the vasculature on the inside. So you're seeing an increased risk for heart disease and stroke. You're seeing if your pelvis starts to fall because your muscles, your pelvic floor muscles need estrogen. If women don't have it, their pelvic floor falls and then they start leaking urine. And when you get to 55 or older and you're having more than 1 or 2 urinary tract infections a year, your risk of dying from urinary tract infections doubles. And so what I see in my practice is I see a number of women over 50 who have these infections, and a lot of times they're hospitalized because these infections are so bad. And they don't know they're coming. They're there for a month, and then all of a sudden, boom, they're in the hospital because they're sick as a dog. And it plays a role with bone density, plays a role with dementia, like I said, plays a role with chronic infection. It plays a role with bowel function because the pelvic floor falls as well, and they lose stool continence. I mean, there's a whole slew of things that are occurring all around these 2 or 3 little hormones that are pretty easy to balance. It's just understanding where to balance them at and why and when.
Interesting. Yeah. And I heard you explain in that presentation that it is a moving target. So it can be a little bit challenging to adjust things as you go. Do you ever have challenges with women who, for whatever reason, whether it's aversion, a taste thing, they're not eating enough fat to help with the regulation of the hormones? Do you ever run into that? And if so, like, how do you help with that?
So yeah, well, and this is where I don't disagree with fasting. I just think we do it way too much. So, if you're fasting once or twice a month, great, not a big deal. But where you're doing intermittent fasting combined with carnivore or keto, women are not getting enough protein and not getting enough fat. Women cannot. So I basically say this: if you're a female and you're not taking in 70 grams of protein, you're going to lose your pelvic floor muscles. You're going to increase your risk for dementia. You're going to have a whole slew of things because your musculature is basically the biggest, or it's the most essential hormone production in your body. It plays a huge role in producing hormones and stabilizing the rest of your health. And so you have to have muscle and you have to have protein to maintain that muscle. Oftentimes women don't eat fat and they're also not eating protein enough. So if I get them to eat more protein, that fat usually comes naturally with that. But if you don't get at least, if I'll shoot for 90 grams of protein with women. If they're not eating at least 45 grams of fat with that, they're not making vitamin D, they're not making the sex hormones, and they're going to have horrible problems with all those issues. One of the issues I see with vegetarians and vegans is they're not eating enough fat, or they're eating plant-based fats, which aren't absorbed as effectively. And within 12 to 24 months, I see them all having depression, anxiety, rapid aging, skin wrinkles, and dementia. So that
Gotcha.
happens over and over again. So in my mind, the number one thing you've got to do is you've got to get enough protein. Number two, that fat content has to be adequate. And if your fat content if your total cholesterol is under 180, your risk for dementia is also doubled, or increases to 50%.
Wow.
So that simple total cholesterol number, I don't want it low. I want it to be above 180. Otherwise, you're at risk for other diseases.
Okay, gotcha. And those numbers again, 90 grams of protein a day and at least 45 grams of fat a day as a bare bones minimum.
There's a bare bones minimum as a female. Now, as a male, because we have 10 times the muscle strength, most men need at a minimum of 120 grams of protein and a minimum of about 60 grams of fat to really feel good. For most men who are physically active or in their 50s or 40s, they need at least around 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Ideal body weight.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that's the recommendation I had gone on. And so that's a little bit more optimistic when people seem like they're struggling to get as much protein as I'm recommending. I might be recommending, 130, 140, 150 grams for women. And yeah, that would be nice. But I find a lot of women are unable to do that. To give them a target of 90 is probably better than what they're doing anyway. And it's nice to know that can be like at least the minimum, right?
Yeah. If you can hit somewhere between 70 and 90, you're going to feel good. You're going to gain your testosterone. Well, so if you don't eat enough protein or you don't eat enough fat, you're going to see two things. Your testosterone will drop 50%. Your thyroid will cut in half. You'll become hypothyroid. And so those two things play a huge role with metabolism. And then all of a sudden women say, I can't lose weight, Dr. Nally, despite all this exercise. I'm exercising an hour a day, but I can't lose weight. Well, it's because you've shut your metabolism down because you have no testosterone and your thyroid has permanently shut down. So the challenge is I have these people that have been on a fasting protocol for over a year or 2 years. And they show up in my office because they regained weight and they can't lose weight anymore. And they're doing the same thing they were doing before. Well, it's because now their metabolism is essentially cut in half, and they have no testosterone to regenerate the muscle mass to help stimulate that growth. So we have to totally tune that up before they ever even start seeing weight loss again.
I see. Gotcha. And I find also that I have to be precise about the way we talk about fasting. So, like, for example, I don't recommend anything outside of 24 hours. I think for some people, if they have a lot of fat to lose, I've seen it myself where they could do a 3-day or a 5-day, not all the time, but from time to time. And I see that people lose maybe a pound a day or a pound and a half a day or whatever, and they feel great. I've seen people PR deadlifts after 5 days of fasting. And so, but I don't mess with that very much. And I'm more used to saying like anything within 24 hours is generally fine. Do you tend to agree with that, or do you also think that that can be pushed too far, especially, well, let's say the person is doing 1 meal a day, but they are getting those targets that you're describing as a minimum. Would that still be okay, or would you still want that person to not go that long without food?
I find it almost impossible to eat 90 grams in one meal. It's
Fair.
almost impossible. I've only met maybe one person that will sit down and have 12 eggs at their meal and 10 pieces of bacon or something like that to get to that 90 or 100 grams of protein. That just doesn't happen. So, and the stomach isn't big enough to hold that, especially women. Men could get away with it, but women can't. So what I normally find is this: you've got to maintain your protein intake in a 3-day window, roughly normal. So if you fast for 18, 24 hours, great. You'll probably catch up your protein the next 2 days. That's fine. But protein is really the signal that tells your body I'm healthy and I'm being fed, or I'm starving. And so if you go, you're fasting 2 or 3 days out of the week and you're doing 18 hours, but you're not hitting your protein marks to get your levels where they need to be, the body's going to say, we need to slow the metabolism down. And it does that by slowing down the thyroid permanently after about 6 to 12 months. And it slows down and it lowers the testosterone by up to 50%, which is what I commonly see. So what I usually say is I'm great with fasting. It works nicely as long as you're hitting your protein marks every 3 days.
That's a great way to think about it. I've never thought about it in that way, but that makes it a little bit kind of easier to say like, okay, say today it just wasn't convenient for you. Maybe you just work through lunch, like no
Yeah.
big deal, but just be focused on that in the next few days. And yeah, you're right. Like even if you took 90 grams of protein, divided it into 2 meals, that's 45 grams each meal. That's enough leucine, presumably, in each one of those meals to help trigger the muscle protein synthesis that we talk about as being so important. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. And so that it's going to give you that. So if you're having 1 or 2 meals during a fasting period that hits your protein marks, you're going to see the tyrosine, the leucine, these other essential amino acids that are going to stimulate your body to not think it's starving. There's a difference between fasting and calorie restriction and starvation. And people don't realize that it's kind of a fine balance. But the key is over a period of a few months, if you are starving yourself, your stomach will shrink and you won't be hungry. And I'll have people come in saying, I can't eat that much. I can't eat that much. And so we have to re-educate them on how to tell their body, you are getting enough fuel to build muscle back and gain that part of it. And then they'll all of a sudden start seeing fat loss. And what I have yet to see is a person who does prolonged fasting, 18, 20 hours, or these 2 or 3 day fasts, and doesn't lose 50% of what their weight loss is in muscle.
Oh,
And
wow.
as soon as they restart eating again, they regain half their weight loss because their body's going, I got to put the muscle back. Got to put the muscle back. So you can lose scale weight, but that's not healthy weight. I want to see fat loss weight, not muscle loss.
Got it.
And that's the difference. That's the difference. I use GLP medications all the time. The Ozempics and the Trulicity. I've been using those since they first got released. In fact, I used to speak for Novo Nordisk when they came out. And so I like them as long as you're getting enough protein every day. And very few doctors ensure that when you're giving those drugs, people are getting adequate protein, because with those drugs, just like starvation, you'll lose fat and muscle. And that's what you've seen if you've listened to PDRT or some of these other guys talking about them. You lose muscle, you lose fat, you lose bone density because you actually aren't eating enough protein.
Got it.
But I've used them for patients for years, and as long as we hit their protein goals, they lose fat and they gain muscle. And that's the difference.
Such a great point that I wish more people would be a little bit less polarized about as far as those weight loss drugs. It's like they do work. We're seeing that they do work, but
they're effective.
Right.
Yeah.
Change your lifestyle also.
They're game changers for diabetics or pre-diabetics that really need the help. So I'm a big fan of them, and I use them all the time, but with the caveat that your diet has to be correct. And when you do it that way, I rarely have to use more than the first 1 to 3 doses of medicine to get through that. You don't have to max these doses out like every other doctor's doing. And all your side effects arise in those drugs because you've maxed these drugs out.
Yep, that's what you hear all the time. Is all the stomach issues happen at the highest doses, and the really, kind of horrible side effects you hear about later on. So that's really helpful. I really appreciate that. I do want to talk to you about muscle, but before we do, for women who have maybe gone the wrong course for a while, say you go in the order that you're talking about. We're going to start with the diet, then we're going to fix the thyroid, then we're going to deal with any hormones. Have you ever really seen that not work, up to and including some women that have maybe gone down the wrong path for a number of years and need to correct or reverse issues that they see?
So the only time I ever see that not work is when you've got someone who has significant trauma. I have patients who have had childhood abuse or trauma or marital abuse, things like that, and they end up using food as a comfort. And so when we get into the real nitty-gritty of what's happening, they'll follow these patterns, but oftentimes their trauma makes it difficult for them to look at food as a fuel. They look at food as a comfort or as a blanket or things like that. That's really the only time. So I actually went and got trained in hypnotherapy, and so my staff does hypnotherapy as well. So that's one of the things we look at is if you're not seeing these processes work, it's because there's something here that's not letting that happen. And that's often where we go next after that is so I'll use hypnotherapy to address it. And frequently it's related to an old issue of abuse, trauma, something that people have some significantly powerful memory and hormones that are tied to experiences in their life. And so that's another piece that's a whole other approach.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It's cool that you offer that. And we're learning so much more about how trauma is affecting so many people out there. So I really do appreciate that. Switching over to the importance of muscle. We talked to lots of different people who also prioritize this, researchers, doctors, practitioners, you name it. Pretend we don't know anything about the importance of muscle and we want to build more or, get on board with that. Are there any particular protocols or things that people should be thinking about when they're thinking about okay, I want to protect this asset?
In regards to muscle?
Yeah, in terms of muscle.
Well, number one, you can't maintain that muscle unless you eat enough protein. That's the most important piece. Protein is an essential nutrient, and you can eliminate all carbohydrates, and there is no disease. If you look at every pathophysiology textbook that exists, if you cut out carbs, no disease arises. But if you cut out protein, a whole slew of diseases arise, and if you cut out fat, a whole slew of diseases arise. So number one, you don't need to have carbs, but you do need protein and you do need fat. Both of those are essential for muscle maintenance. And so I'll usually give them a baseline. And then what I often do myself is I'll say, okay, look, I want you to start with a diet that is 50-50 protein fat by grams. So I'll say, if you're a woman, I want you to eat 50 grams of protein and 50 grams of fat. Start there. And they're going, I can't even, I'm so full with this. The nice thing is they never snack because they're so full, which is very helpful. And then if they're not seeing weight loss, then we'll bring the fat back a little bit because they may not need so much if they're heavily insulin dominant or insulin resistant. So you've got to start with protein and fat. That's where I start there. And the second piece is, once you get the diet dialed in, then you've got to stimulate muscle growth. And I'm a huge fan of exercise, but I'm a fan of the right exercise. You can see very successful weight loss with resistance exercise. Fantastic. And so I have patients that do very well with just 3 days of resistance exercise. I have patients that do very poorly when they don't rest the muscles every other day. So if you don't give yourself a muscle rest from that exercise type, the stress response and the cortisol released by that, especially in women, stops their weight loss. So if you're going to do cardiovascular exercise, do it 3 days a week, and on the other 3 days a week, do some type of cardio if you want to, or do Pilates or do something different. So for me, I do strength training 3 days a week, and if I can, I'll sword fight 2 or 3 days a week. And so those are the different, that's what I do. And sword fighting is really hit exercise is what we do. So it's high intensity interval training, where you're doing between 1 and 4 minutes of high intensity exercise. If you scale 1 to 10, 10 being the most exertion you've ever experienced, you're doing 8 to 9 for at least a minute of that. And then you rest for a little bit, and you do that 4 times. So if you did 30 minutes where you had an episode of 1 to 4 minutes of high intensity, and then rest, and then high intensity, then rest, and high intensity, then rest, that is tremendous exercise for both the heart and the muscles.
Got it. Sword fighting. That's so badass, dude. That's so cool.
I love
okay.
sword fighting. Yeah.
That sounds amazing. I've heard you describe it before, and it sounds very primal. I love it. Any particular, like, I guess, equipment? Do you prescribe like sets and reps, certain exercises when somebody's thinking about resistance training? Are there core principles that you generally recommend, or is it more just like, look, you need to resistance train?
I tell people, do what you like, because you're less likely to get hurt at it. Now, for people who are fairly heavily overweight, I tell them, start with your body weight. Start with simple body weight exercises. There's some great, I have them on my website. They're free. You can get some body weight exercises that can do between 1 and 6 days a week, where you just are using your own body weight with squats and push-ups and sit-ups and jumps, just simple body weight. And that's enough to really stimulate some significant interval training with that type of exercise. So I tell people, start with basic body weight exercises. It doesn't cost you anything. You can do it in your closet or in your bedroom floor. When you start getting past that and those become too weak for you, then dumbbells are great. And so right now at my house, I have bands, I have dumbbells, and I have some mats to do body weight exercises. That's really what I do. That's what my family does. We also have horses, and so I throw bales of hay, and we do horseback riding and things of that nature. So that's a different form of exercise, but simple exercise to start out with is what you like doing. If you like to do it, you're much less likely to get injured. If you hate running, you're more likely to get injured running. So do something different: swim or jog or hike or something. Do Pilates, do yoga, something like that.
Yeah. Do you have a tricky time with people that are maybe overdoing the quote unquote cardio aspect of things, especially with women?
Oh, I have women that want to run 6 miles every day, and they would if you let them. But they show up in my office with injuries at 4 times a year, and that's the problem. So I have to tell them, look, you can exercise, but doing that every day is going to be a problem for you unless you're an ultra marathoner. That's unless you train your body for 20 years to do that kind of work, your body's not ready to do that. So I tell them, if you're going to run 3 days a week. And then on the other 3 days a week, if you want to exercise, do a different kind of exercise. It can be mixed. It can be yoga. It can be Pilates. It can be weights. It could be, even if you run one day and you hike the next day, you're using the muscles differently, and you'll see less injury with that.
I like that. I just interviewed Brad Kearns, who just co-wrote the book with Mark Sisson called Born to Walk, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference to Born to Run, where they argue the running boom, the athletic shoes with the big cushion heel that pitch people forward were some of the worst things to ever happen. As part of what they wrote in the book, they go over the injury statistics of runners, and the percentages are nuts. I knew it was bad, but it was like 50% of runners will be chronically injured annually, almost. Like they compared it to numbers of NFL players, and it wasn't close. Like just your everyday average runner, the injury numbers were crazy. I couldn't believe it.
It's insane. My wife and her friends, she was part of a running group when we probably about 10 years ago. Then they would do marathons at least once a year. They would run St. George Marathon and these various marathons around the West Coast, and they would train excessively, and at least once or twice a year, one of them was injured with something at their knee or their ankle, and it just over and over again. And they were following these running programs that would push them really hard to get ready for a marathon, 2 or 3 times a year. And it's overuse, and then you create problems because you got cortisol released, and then you're not losing weight, and then you're having stress, and you're not sleeping, and then you can't exercise. So it's this repetitive pattern. That's why I like that title, walking rather than running. That's where I realized that you can get some really simple exercise done with walking or hiking or some other simple kind of exercise, as long as you're consistent with it and you're doing it for 10-15 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned marathons. I thought this was hilarious. Another one of the things they talk about is the actual distance that Philippides, I think his name was 25 miles. It only became 26.2 miles in the London Olympics in the late 1800s when they needed to run an extra 1.2 miles to get to the stadium. So their argument, and Philippides ran 153 miles twice to run to Sparta and back before he ran a marathon and then ran back to Athens. So it's all bogus. It was a super endurance, ultra marathon that he ran anyway, and it's an arbitrary number, the 26.2. So let's just call a marathon 8 miles. Everybody could just go run 8 miles, not get beat up, and enjoy breakfast afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
I personally hate running, and if my wife says, "Do you want to go run?" I said, "Only if I'm being chased by a bear."
Yeah.
That's for me. Running sucks, but I get a better workout from fighting with my swordmaster in 20 minutes than I do running, and it's intense, and I'm using my entire body, and that I love to do, and so I'll do that and I do great. But every time I've tried to incorporate a running program, I'm injured once or twice a year because it's just not. It's not what my body wants to do.
Yeah, you heard it here first. For the listeners, if you see Dr. Nally or I running down the road, you should run as well. We're running from something. And then it's so important to note, like if you continue running, you are making yourself efficient. And that's really good if you want to run a long distance. That's exactly what it's doing. But efficiency means you're burning less all the time. And I would measure this on metabolic carts. I worked on a metabolic cart for over a decade, and you will teach yourself to burn less and less calories while doing the resistance training does absolutely the opposite. It makes you inefficient. It tells your body, gives your body the signal that you need to get stronger and build muscle, and that requires energy, which means you're burning more calories all the time versus the opposite effect, which is why you see so many of these marathon runners that are wearing jackets in July. They're freezing cold because their metabolic rate is so low.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Man, I have thoroughly loved this conversation. This has been great. You have so much energy. And yeah, again, I followed your work for a long time, and I really appreciate you covering all the different angles and being really thoughtful with your answers. So I really appreciate it. Dr. Adam Nally, where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work? And also be sure to talk about the new book that you have.
You can find me at www.docmuscles.com. I've converted a lot of my stuff over to my daily email. I have a daily or every other day email that comes out. So if you go to that website and you can register for my email, I send out, I think, 12,000 emails a day to patients, and most of them are patients that follow me, but I have a lot of patients around the world that like the email. And I talk about everything. I've found that what makes me tick is knowing a little interesting stuff about all sorts of things. And so the emails they're not generic, and I write them all. They're mine. I'll take topics from various things that I hear about or learn about. Most of them are probably medically related, but a lot of them have psychological relation or just interesting stuff that I find interesting myself. So that's probably that's where I'm seeing the most is through my emails.
Okay,
and
great.
you register those through at docmuscles.com.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely link that. And like I said, Dr. Nally, it was really great to have you on. Such an honor to host you. And I really appreciate your depth and breadth of knowledge and all the things that we covered in this conversation. So thank you so very much for everything that you've done. And thank you for taking time to be on our show today. Really appreciate you.
Thank you. What a great podcast. I'm excited to hear more about it.
So much fun. Thanks a lot. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.